In September 1999, in the quiet town of Shepherdsville, Kentucky, an event occurred that shook the local community. Jessica Dishon, a 17-year-old girl, disappeared under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind a trail of questions and suspicions. Her disappearance and the subsequent investigation unfolded like the script of a gripping yet tragic film, demonstrating how reality sometimes surpasses any fiction. Jessica was born on May 2, 1982, the eldest of 3 children in her family. From a young age, she displayed remarkable independence, helping her parents take care of her younger brothers. At 15, she took a part-time job at a local restaurant, aiming to save up for her own car, a red Pontiac she dreamed of. Despite her busy schedule, Jessica excelled in school and planned to attend college to become an accountant. In the fall of 1999, when Jessica was in her senior year of high school, her life seemed to be going perfectly. She had started dating a boy and was full of hope for the future. However, on September 10th, everything changed. That morning, Jessica's parents left for work as usual, and her younger brothers went to school. Jessica stayed home alone, intending to drive to school in her car. However, when her mother returned home around 1 p.m., she noticed that Jessica's car was still parked in front of the house. This was unusual, as her daughter should have been in class by that time. The concerned mother entered the house, hoping to find Jessica in her room, possibly sick or oversleeping, but the bedroom was empty. Attempts to contact her husband proved futile. He confirmed that he had gone to work alone that morning. Approaching her daughter's car, the woman encountered a disturbing scene. The driver's door was ajar. Jessica's cell phone lay on the seat with the numbers 9 and 1 dialed. Under the seat, one of the girl's sneakers and her car keys were scattered, while her textbooks, work clothes, and purse were on the back seat. This scene aroused the worst fears. Evidently, Jessica had tried to dial 911, but something had prevented her. Leaving all her belongings in the car and walking away seemed unlikely, given the distance of their house from the town center. The parents contacted the school, where they were informed that Jessica hadn't shown up for any classes. This was a violation of school rules, which should have notified them of their daughter's absence much earlier. A few hours later, they received a call from Jessica's best friend, who worked with her at the restaurant. She said the girl hadn't shown up for her shift, which only heightened their concerns. Faced with this alarming situation, Jessica's parents decided to contact the police. They drove to the sheriff's office, where they reported their daughter's disappearance and the suspicious circumstances surrounding her car. However, the sheriff's reaction was unexpected. He suggested that the girl had simply gone somewhere and would return home sooner or later, advising the parents to wait until the next day. Even the fact that one sneaker was left in the car didn't raise his suspicions. Outraged by such indifference, Jessica's parents tried to convince the sheriff of the seriousness of the situation, but to no avail. They were forced to return home and act on their own. They called all relatives, acquaintances, and friends, but no one had seen Jessica. Together, they drove around the entire town, but the search proved fruitless. The next morning, the parents again approached the sheriff, insisting that their daughter still hadn't returned. This time, the sheriff sent 2 officers to their house to examine Jessica's car. However, problems arose here as well. The police acted unprofessionally, examining the car without gloves, touching everything inside. After a superficial inspection, they left without taking any potential evidence and didn't even examine the girl's room, which contradicted standard investigation procedures. Faced with police inaction, Jessica's parents decided to act on their own. They turned to local media, telling them about their daughter's disappearance and how the police weren't showing proper interest in the case. Together with relatives and friends, they organized their own search and distributed numerous flyers with information about the missing girl. The search operation was led by Jessica's father and his brother Stanley. They knew the area well and tried to determine where the girl was most likely to be. By that time, they were already fearing the worst and decided to search the area near the local river. This area had a bad reputation among residents. The thickets and inaccessibility made it attractive for criminal activities, from drug dealing to more serious crime. The girl's relatives spent several hours there but found nothing. The next day, an event occurred that added a new twist to this story. Jessica's parents were at home when their son, who was playing in the yard, suddenly ran into the house. He claimed to have heard a scream for help and was sure it was Jessica's voice. The girl's father, grabbing a shotgun, ran outside, trying to determine the source of the scream. At that moment, his brother Stanley drove up to their house and immediately joined the search. Soon they noticed smoke rising from the property of a neighbor, 40-year-old David Brooks. As they got closer, they saw the man burning something that looked like clothing. This raised suspicion, and Jessica's father asked permission to inspect Brooks's farm. However, Brooks categorically refused and demanded that they leave. The missing girl's relatives noticed another strange detail. Before Jessica's disappearance, they had maintained normal relations with Brooks and his family. But after the incident, his behavior changed drastically. He began regularly driving past their house at low speed, watching them and smiling. Jessica's parents also started receiving strange phone calls, during which an unknown man would remain silent and just, They suspected it might be Brooks, but didn't understand the reasons for such behavior. After the incident with the burning clothes, Jessica's parents again turned to the police, who still showed no activity in the search. This time, officers went to Brooks' property with search dogs. The dogs were given Jessica's belongings to sniff, and they indicated the ashes from the fire, but no useful evidence was found there. The dogs also found black gloves in one of the barns, on which they detected the smell of decay. Throughout this time, Brooks behaved very suspiciously, especially when officers approached the place where he had been burning things. Despite this, the police saw no direct connection between Brooks and the girl's disappearance. Disappointed with the police action, Jessica's parents decided to turn to the FBI. Despite the fact that the Bureau usually doesn't start investigations at the request of missing persons' relatives, this time, they decided to intervene. Immediately after hearing all the disturbing facts discovered by the girl's parents, FBI agents concluded that something serious might indeed have happened to Jessica. From this point on, a full-fledged investigation began, which the local police had refused to conduct. Just the physically alone, I mean, that's a lot. That's a lot of, FBI agents took fingerprints from Jessica's room and her car and seized all potential physical evidence for laboratory examination. In parallel, they organized large-scale searches of the area, involving helicopters and volunteers. They also thoroughly examined the bottom of a pond near the girl's house in case her body might be there. During the search of Brooks' farm, FBI agents made a disturbing discovery in one of the barns. They found a printed photograph of Jessica. This strengthened suspicions about Brooks' involvement in the case. Investigators also suspected that his 35-year-old brother Joseph might be involved, as his behavior also. However, the investigation faced a serious problem. No direct evidence was found during the search that would allow the brothers to be arrested. Therefore, the agents focused their efforts on the search, almost certain that the girl was already dead. On September 27th, 17 days after Jessica's disappearance, the police received a call. A woman driving on a road near the river, where the girl's father and friends had searched in the first days, noticed something suspicious. Stopping by a tree, growing a few dozen meters from the road, she saw what looked like a human body and immediately notified the police. FBI agents arriving at the scene found the body of a dead girl with missing fingers and limbs. There was a rope on her legs with traces of red and silver paint. Some of her clothes were missing, suggesting sexual violence. Due to the significant degree of decomposition, visual identification was impossible, so officers turned to Jessica's parents for help with identification. The girl's father couldn't bring himself to look at the body, but her mother agreed. Arriving at the scene, she couldn't recognize the face, but immediately noticed a small butterfly tattoo on the body. exactly like her daughters. Medical experts confirmed the identity of the deceased and established that the cause of death was strangulation. Numerous scratches were found on Jessica's body. Experts also determined that the limbs and fingers had been separated from the body after death. Another fact became a real blow to Jessica's parents. It turned out that she had been alive for about 3 days after her disappearance, explaining how she was previously deadletted after her disappearance. This meant that the police had a real chance to save her. After the body was discovered, FBI agents decided to reinterrogate Brooks. The man initially claimed to have seen Jessica near her house on the morning she disappeared. Now, he changed his story, stating that he hadn't seen her that day, but had instead been at home in bed with his wife. Over the next few years, the case didn't progress, and interest in it almost faded. The situation changed only in 2012, when a new detective, Lynn Hunt, joined the local department. She was assigned to work on old unsolved cases and decided to focus primarily on Jessica Dishon's murder. After familiarizing herself with the case materials, Hunt was shocked by the unprofessionalism of her predecessors. Almost all documents were filled out with errors. There were no records of conversations with case participants, and physical evidence wasn't properly processed. In essence, she had to start the investigation almost from scratch, 13 years after the murder. Hunt's first step was to talk to the girl's relatives. One of her brothers, by then already an adult and independent, handed the detective a box with Jessica's belongings from her car, which he had kept since the police returned these items to the family. Hunt was again struck by how carelessly her colleagues had treated potential evidence, not storing it properly in the warehouse as required by the rules. Now, after so many years, these items were unlikely to help shed light on what had happened. Despite this, she continued to carefully study everything she could find. Soon, she came across an interesting detail in the documents: a medical report on Brooks. According to it, the man's IQ was only 61 points, which is considered an extremely low score. This cast doubt on all previous police actions, including Brooks' interrogations. And with such a level of intelligence, he might simply not have understood most of the questions asked of him and given inadequate answers. This information made Hunt wonder if Brooks might not have been involved in the case at all, as his strange behavior could easily be explained by his extremely low IQ. She then began to consider other possible versions and suspects, carefully examining everyone who had been mentioned in the case or just lived nearby. Then, this continued until September 2014, almost exactly 15 years after Jessica's death. The detective received a call from a colleague working in another jurisdiction. He reported that he had received interesting information from a Kentucky state prison. One of the inmates was talking about knowing the true identity of Jessica Dishon's killer. Approached this message with skepticism. Usually when inmates expressed the desire to share some information with the police, it ended in disappointment and wasted time. Most of them made up stories to get early release or improve their detention conditions. However, she understood that she couldn't ignore this information. Hunt went to the prison and met with the man who claimed to possess important information. It turned out that this man had shared a cell for some time with another inmate convicted of sexual crimes against minors under the same article, for which he himself had ended up in prison. On this basis, they grew close and shared details of their crimes. One day, his cellmate told him that, among other things, he had killed Jessica Dish. The informant gave the detective the name of this man, which shocked Hunt. It was Stanley Dishon, Jessica's uncle and her father's brother. According to the informant, Stanley told him that he had subjected the girl to sexual abuse for several years during her childhood when he lived in their house. He had threatened to kill her or someone close to her if she told anyone about what was happening. In the spring of 1999, when Jessica got a boyfriend, Stanley began to fear that, sooner or later, she might confess to him about what her uncle had been doing to her. He was angry because she was having a relationship with a boy her own age, someone she liked. He kept calling the boy "little bastard" and insulted her as well. Okay. On the morning of September 10th, Stanley came to her house when the girl was alone. She had already gathered her belongings and was about to get into her car when he approached her and demanded that she immediately break up with her boyfriend. Jessica refused to listen to him and threatened to tell someone about his abuse if he didn't leave her alone. Stanley began to threaten her, and Jessica reached for the phone, trying to dial 911. Stanley tried to grab her, but Jessica broke free and ran into the house. The man followed her to her room, hit her, and wrapped her in her sheets. He then took her to an abandoned barn near the place where her body would later be found. Stanley kept her alive there for several days, abusing her and subjecting her to sexual violence. Then he killed her, dragged the body to a visible place so it could be discovered, and buried the sheets in the ground under the barn. He also said that after the murder, he dismembered some of her limbs to make it look like drug dealers were involved. Detective Hunt immediately noted that this information had never been made public. Only Jessica's closest relatives knew that the girl was missing some limbs, so the informant clearly couldn't have made this up. Finally, he added that Stanley had buried Jessica's sneaker under a broken tree near the barn. The informant stated some of her personal belongings are under a tree that's fallen in that area. Hunt decided to verify the information about the buried evidence. Given the limited staff of the local police department, none of her colleagues could help her with this case, so she turned to Jessica's brother and several other relatives who agreed to participate in the search. The detective didn't reveal to them that Stanley might be the killer, as she first needed to find confirmation of such shocking accusations. On the first day of the search, they failed to find any evidence. In pouring rain, they dug in places that fit the informant's description, but to no avail. The next day, Jessica's brother and Hunt went back to search. On the way, the man pointed out an abandoned barn to the detective. They headed there and began digging the ground. Almost immediately, they made their long-awaited breakthrough. They found a buried sheet. Hunt immediately went to Jessica's house. Throughout all these years, her parents hadn't made any changes to her room. It remained exactly as it had been on the day of their daughter's disappearance. Thanks to this, the detective easily confirmed that the found sheet was part of Jessica's bedding set. It was missing from her bed, and the other bedding elements had the same pattern. Sinanya. It was one of my favorite things. It was really cool. It was the best. It was really cool. It was so cool. After this, Stanley was arrested and brought in for questioning. The man refused to confess to the crime, but during the conversation with investigators, he was visibly shaking. As a result, he was arrested and the case was taken to court. He was prosecuted for some offenses, including a sale to drug abusers in their homes. Jessica's father couldn't believe that his own brother had done such a thing to his daughter. He remained in denial for a long time. However, over time, he came to terms with this unbearable fact. Later, he recalled that in the first days after Jessica's disappearance, it was Stanley who suggested searching for the body near the river. But during the search, Stanley suddenly became nauseous and took his brother home. It turned out that this happened just a few hundred meters from the barn where Jessica had been held. I mean, it got self-infernoed trying to expel Jessica's soul. Stanley had clearly thrown them off track, preventing them from finding her while she was still alive. During the preparation for the trial, Detective Hunt continued to investigate the suspect's past, trying to find additional evidence. She already knew that he had served time for sexual violence against another girl from their family. But soon, something even more shocking came to light. Several other women closely related to Stanley told the police that he had subjected them to sexual abuse at an early age. When they went to court, it was some signs that actually happened. Somebody had to actually get hurt. All these cases followed a similar pattern. Stanley would ask to stay with his relatives since he didn't have his own place at the time. When he was left alone with the girls, he would abuse them and force them to keep silent by using threats. After compiling all these testimonies, the police concluded that Stanley had been doing this for 3 decades. Despite all these facts, Detective Hunt understood that securing a conviction in the murder case would be quite difficult, as there was practically no direct evidence against Stanley, such as fingerprints or DNA. She continued to carefully study the case materials and unexpectedly came across a box of papers she hadn't seen before. The papers were old, and they had withdrawings of pictures that looked like Mark. After examining its contents, Hunt was once again shocked by the incompetence of her predecessors who had handled this case in the early years. In the box was a letter dated June 26, 2002. In it, another informant wrote to the police the same thing that Hunt had only heard 12 years later from the inmate in the Kentucky prison. As of the summer of 2002, Stanley was already serving time for sexual assault on an underage relative, and even then, he had told his cellmate that he had killed Jessica. The cellmate, who was cooperating with the police department handling the case, detailing everything Stanley had said about murdering his niece. Surprisingly, the police simply ignored this letter. Apparently in those years, they were so convinced of Brooks' involvement that they didn't even consider other suspects. Hunt was deeply disappointed by such behavior from her colleagues because if it weren't for their mistakes, the case could have been solved back in 2002. But now, after all these years, all she could do was wait for the trial and hoped that Stanley would be punished for what he had done. The trial began in 2015, and Stanley pleaded not guilty. Jessica's parents, present in the courtroom, could barely raise their eyes to look at their relative who had destroyed their lives. They were also enraged by the fact that he wasn't able to ease their suffering and confess to what he had done. The prosecution was aware that the chance of a conviction in the murder case was low. I've been raising my family for like 3 months around here, Stanley said. I have pled nothing. It's very clear that if regarding the cases of sexual abuse against other relatives, there was also a problem. Each of them would have to testify before the jury and detail what Stanley had done to them, as well as listen to how his lawyer tried to cast doubt on their testimony. Considering all these circumstances, Stanley was offered a plea deal. The prosecution agreed to drop the demand for the death penalty in exchange for Stanley pleading guilty to sexual crimes against his relatives and the manslaughter of Jessica. In the end, the man agreed and admitted his guilt. Under the terms of the agreement, he didn't have to reveal any details of what he had done, which greatly upset the victim's parents. Stanley was prosecuted and forced to relive some of the demands of what he did to his parents, which greatly upset the victim's parents. They wanted Stanley to tell the whole truth, but he continued to remain silent. According to the terms of the deal, the killer received 20 years in prison with the right to apply for early release after 15 years. Given that he was 56 years old at the time of sentencing, Stanley could be released at the age of 71. After the sentence was announced, Jessica's father stated that if his brother didn't die in prison, he would be waiting for him upon release to settle the score himself. In 2019, Stanley gave his first interview in which he claimed his innocence in Jessica's murder. According to him, he was at work that morning, but it was impossible to confirm this after 2 decades. He also couldn't explain how 2 informants who didn't know each other could have made up identical stories with facts that should have been known only to the killer. As for David Brooks, detectives still don't rule out his possible minor involvement in this case. Stanley was acquainted with him and could have asked the man to help him dispose of the victim's belongings. Given his low level of intelligence, Brooks might not have fully realized the seriousness of what was happening. It's possible that he was burning the girl's clothes in that fire, and the gloves on which the dogs detected the smell of decay were also given to him by Stanley. And And he might have left Jessica's photo in his barn to frame the man. However, we are unlikely to ever know the whole truth. Brooks died in 2021 due to heart problems. It's also worth mentioning the moment when, on the third day after Jessica's disappearance, her younger brother heard a cry for help in front of the house, and it seemed to him that it was his sister. To this day, it can't be said with full certainty what it really was. At that time, the girl should have still been alive, but Stanley was keeping her in a barn several kilometers away from her house. Most likely, the child either just imagined it due to such strong stress, or someone else was screaming. But there are also less plausible versions. As we remember, immediately after Jessica's father ran outside, Stanley drove up to the house, which means he was nearby. One could assume that the girl was in his car with her mouth taped or unconscious. However, this theory seems unlikely. So, this tragic story demonstrates how important it is to take every case of a missing person seriously, especially when it comes to children and teenagers. It also underscores the need for professional and thorough investigation from the very beginning, as the first days after disappearance are often critical. Additionally, this case reminds us of the importance of being attentive to signs of family violence and not ignoring suspicious behavior, even from close relatives. Friends, what do you think about this story? Write your opinion in the comments, and also subscribe to my YouTube channel and other social networks. You'll find links to them in the description under this video. Until we meet again, I just wanted to say a big thank you to everyone who watched this video all the way through. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this case in the comments. And please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. I'd also like to send a special thank you to everyone who has donated to support my channel. Your support means the world to me and gives me the motivation to keep making new and interesting investigations for you, my wonderful viewers. Thank you all so much.